morning and welcome to all those watching today's discussion in person and online. I'm Aparna Pande, Director of Hudson Institute's Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia. The recent state assembly elections in India have demonstrated once again that Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party have created an electoral juggernaut. Coming 3 years after Mr. Modi's won a landslide victory in the national elections, this suggests an inflection point in Indian politics. Anyone seeking to understand the rise of the BJP needs to understand the BJP's ideological mentor organization, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS, and the dozens of affiliated organizations around it, referred to colloquially as the Sangh Parivar, or the RSS family. We are delighted to have with us today Professor Walter Andersen, who has spent decades researching the RSS and the BJP and has built deep contacts within both organizations. His first book, The Brotherhood in Saffron, came out in the 1980s, and his recent book is titled The RSS, A View to the Inside. Professor Andersen served as a special assistant to the US Ambassador to India, William Clark, as well as in Washington, D.C., when he retired in 2004 as head of Office of Research for South Asia. Following that, he joined the faculty at the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University, where he became administrative director of its South Asian Studies and recently retired. We are also delighted to have with us today my colleague and good friend Eric Brown, who is senior fellow and works on Asian and Middle Eastern affairs, international security, and US diplomacy and strategy. I would now like to turn to Professor Andersen and ask him to offer his introductory remarks, after which we will have a conversation. Thank you, Professor Andersen.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Aparna Pande for organizing this. I've known Aparna for years and have great respect for her and for what she's done. This is the first time I've met you, I think, and but I've heard very good things about you as well. The group we're talking about is, needless to say, also somewhat controversial. It is powerful, and to a certain extent, the very fact it has become powerful, or at least influential, is an indication of or a sign of the controversy that's developed around it. Two basic reasons why it's controversial. One is its Hindu nationalist ideology, and the questions you may want to ask me about that, because I won't say too much about that here. And secondly is its links to the ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, and as Aparna noted in the recent elections, the BJP did very well, in fact, better than many expected, in fact, that it itself expected, and it won the critical state of Uttar Pradesh, which is India's most populous state, and whoever controls that, this is indication that they may do well in the national elections that are coming up in a few years. I want to do a little PR for the book, which you did a little bit. I'll do a little bit as well. For those who are interested in buying it, it actually comes out, a little bit confusing. It's come out in two places. It's come out in London by Hearst and distributed by Oxford, and its title is Messengers of Hindu Nationalism. That's the one you get here, in the way that they've divided the world up into who publishes books. It's also published by Penguin in South Asia, Penguin in India, and the title there is RSS, A View to the Inside, which is what you had mentioned, and which it came out earlier than the other one, which I'm not quite sure why. And so people who wanted to get an advanced copy of it a year or two ago usually got that one as well. There's also an English language version that's just come out in Pakistan by the Royal Press in Karachi, and there's a Mandarin language which has come out about a year ago by the People's Publishing House in Beijing, and there's a Hindi version that's now in the process of being translated. So go to your computer and order a copy as soon as possible. Now, what makes the RSS influential is the broad range, which you suggested, the broad range of affiliated groups that are around it, and there are about 100 of them, including the ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party. Now, these affiliated groups are active in virtually every area of Indian life. It is India's largest trade union is associated with it, its largest set of private schools is associated with it, and its largest student organizations are associated. To give you some sense of the broad scope of the affiliated organizations, one is focused on widows and how to make the life of widows a better life for widows. Another one has to do with Muslims. There is a Muslim affiliated organization, And in fact, the RSS, since the 1970s, late 70s, has been open to Muslims and Christians. And there are even a few Muslim full-time workers in the RSS. Now, regarding the RSS, there are a number of analytical misconceptions, which is basically why this book was written. First is the argument that it's monolithic. It is not monolithic. In fact, there are a number of deep debates within the RSS and its affiliated organizations. Among them is questions of foreign direct investment. There's one affiliated group which is directly opposed, which you probably have seen that group, is directly opposed to foreign direct investment. The government itself and Prime Minister Modi is actually strongly in favor of foreign direct investment. And at the Davos meeting 2 years ago, he made a major speech and somewhat reflecting what the Chinese president had talked about and being open to foreign investment. He said India is just as open to foreign investment, but back home, not everybody in the RSS or the affiliated organizations agreed with that. A second major misconception is that it's a religious organization. It's not. It is a cultural organization, and it tends to be somewhat favorable to Hindu issues like the construction of temples, which has now taken a very active role in supporting. But many of its leaders are agnostic and some are even atheists, in fact. A third misconception is that the organization is limited to Hindus. It's not. Most of the members are religiously Hindu, but there are Muslim members, there are Christian members, and Sikhs, but they consider the Sikhs Hindus. So that's, for them, that's not a separate category. Now, what makes the RSS interesting to me as a political scientist is its ties to India's ruling party, the BJP. And as you noted, that it did very well in the recent elections. In fact, it or its allies now are governing in 18 of India's 36 states and union territories. One prominent scholar on India has recently written that the prospects are that the BJP will likely remain in power for a long period of time, and the recent state elections are a sign of that. Now, for those of you who are new to this subject, the 96-year-old RSS is the largest and most influential agency of Hindu nationalism in India. There are about 3 to 4 million men and boys who regularly participate in its some 70,000 meeting places, which are called shakas. They have a training system referred to as character building, and the aim is to create perfected men who work full-time to bring about social unity. And the key goal of the RSS is to have a social unity in the country. That is a constant theme that it argues about. Now, the founder of the RSS in 1925 believed that India's colonial status was due to the country's deep social divisions, such as caste and language. And independence would not come unless Indians thought of themselves as a people. He modeled his ideology on the writings of Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, who spoke and developed the notion of Hindutva, or Hinduness, which, among other things, laid out an analysis of who constituted the people. It was a definition that, in the Indian context, effectively excluded Muslims and Christians by saying an Indian was a person who identified with India as his or her fatherland and as his holy land. So that, of course, meant that Muslims and Christians could not be defined as Hindu. And he also, interestingly enough, rejected the hierarchical caste system. He was an atheist, as a matter of fact. Mm-hmm. He went to great length to argue that Hindutva is not a religious philosophy or a religion, but it is a culture. The RSS takes a similar stand, except that it now says that Christians and Muslims are Indian by ethnicity and citizenship, which is why its current head has somewhat said controversially that Hindus and Muslims are Hindu. And by that he means in a cultural sense, not a religious sense. Now, the partition of India in 1947 into a Muslim majority Pakistan and a Hindu majority India led to the mass migration of over 12 million Hindus and Muslims in various directions. And it created the violence that led to the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi in 1948. It was briefly banned and was effectively excluded from the Congress and its various affiliated groups, which most support the Congress. Most people in the RSS had earlier supported the Congress Party, and it itself had stayed out largely, really had a very apolitical attitude. Reacting to the ban, the RSS sought to remain both a non-political cultural organization and yet influence the political system by permitting its activist members to form the Bharatiya Janata Sangh, which was its name, until 1980 when it became the Bharatiya Janata Party. And also gradually the various affiliated groups were formed around it. Most of the few remarks I want to say before I take the questions and answers, because I think that's the most useful part of what we are engaged in here and more useful for understanding what it's all about, is most of my remarks are based on the recent book that myself and Sridhar Damle wrote, Messengers of Hindu Nationalism, which was published by Hearst and distributed by Oxford. And at this point, I want to give thanks, as I always do when I talk about the book, to the late Professors Suzanne Rudolph and Lloyd Rudolph at the University of Chicago, who were my advisors for the dissertation and who mentored the first book on the RSS, the one we mentioned, The Brotherhood in Saffron, published about 3 decades ago, and recently republished by Penguin, and it's available on Amazon. The Rudolphs encouraged us to bring out another version because India had changed a great deal, and their argument that India has also changed a great deal as well. So what's different from the RSS now, and I'll sort of conclude with a couple differences, than now from what it was at the time our book was written? Perhaps the most obvious difference is that the RSS and its family of affiliated organizations at the time of the earlier book were relatively marginal players and largely unknown outside India in the late 1980s. In fact, Lloyd and Suzanne Rudolph were one of the few people, scholars, who had actually met Guru Gowalkar, who was the second head of the RSS. And when I got to India, I was intending to do something else. And they said, no, you have a great opportunity. Nobody has written about the RSS. Write a book and go and see the various people, which I did. In fact, I had a rare opportunity actually to stay at the RSS headquarters through a series of events I won't talk about now. And it was fascinating because, I would go over to Hedgabad Bhavan, which is the RSS headquarters in Nagpur, every day by bicycle, and have breakfast with Gowalkar. We'd talk a bit, and then he opened up the archives to me. And I later found out that they had actually debated whether to see me or not, and they made a decision that, well, we might as well see him. We met the Rudolphs, and they seemed to be serious, and so let's see, what he is all about. So I did that. So, the first major difference, so therefore, was, it's much more. It's much better known. Now, second big difference is it's much more diverse. The RSS in the 1980s and earlier had drawn largely from an urban Hindu high caste and lower middle class recruitment pool in the Hindi-speaking areas of the North. That is no longer the case. It's become far more inclusive. It has a strong rural base. It draws from the so-called other backward classes, or OBCs, of which the Prime Minister is one, and those at the bottom of the Hindu ritual scale, the so-called scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. As I mentioned, it now accepts Muslims and Christian members, though their numbers are comparatively few. And it has shakas, which are the local units, of which there are about 70,000 in India, in every part of the country. A third and related change is the growing resilience of the RSS on lobbying the government, primarily on behalf of its 100 affiliates to influence the policy process. This is what has created some controversy regarding the role of the RSS, is it has gotten quite involved, and the government, at least Prime Minister Modi, far more than the previous BJP Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, has actually consulted them on key issues. The current head of the RSS, Mohan Bhagwat, since taking over as head of the organization in 2009, has emerged as the most outspoken and most political head of the RSS in its 96-year history. He gave a set of speeches in September 2018 in Delhi, for example, that provided policy recommendations of extraordinary consequence. And in the detail of that, he altered the stated mission of the RSS as being an exclusively cultural organization into one that has a strong political overtone to it. No longer is its goal primarily to train young men in its daily shakas, who, based on that training, would on their own engage in efforts to improve the country. It now admits to taking an active role in the policy process. Maybe there I'll stop and I'll let the two of you ask questions. And let's see, do I have a fourth reason why it's changed? Let me just check to see. I think those are the major ones. Yeah, those are the major ones.
Well,
Thank you. Eric.
it's terrific. Thanks very much for being here, and thank you for your pioneering work on a really, truly fascinating subject and a complex one in certainly one of the most consequential countries in the world. I had a softball question for you to begin with, which was how you got interested in the RSS in the first place, and you answered that. So I have a slightly more interesting, perhaps difficult one, which pertains to ideology that you had mentioned earlier. And that's this: how do you understand the RSS's view of its cultural project and the difference between that and actually existing Hinduism? I mention that, of course, because it's always struck me, but Hinduism is a uniquely capacious and deeply pluralistic religious tradition, or a tradition of many religions. And in fact, Swami Vivekananda, as we all know, when he launched the first Vedantic mission here in the United States, said what makes Hinduism exceptional amongst the world's religions was that it accepted all religions as true. That pluralism became an argument for Hindu exceptionalism, one could say. But the Hindutva project is also characterized by a lot of people who study it, both in India and here in the United States, as a political project that has a homogenizing objective and tendency to it. So I was curious your thinking about the tensions between actually existing Hinduism and the Hindutva project and how the RSS conceptualizes it.
Well, as I mentioned, they don't think of themselves as a quote-unquote religious organization in that they don't have metaphysical concerns. Their concerns are here on earth and what you do. And if anything, they link themselves to 19th century Europe romantic nationalism. That there are a series of places, events, memories that construct what it is to be a people. And among them, for example, are the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana, various local songs that are associated, or chants that are associated with the people. I was just reading an interesting book last night by a person, a Dalit from the lower caste, who is not a friend of the RSS, but mentioned that what the RSS has done so cleverly to recruit and mobilize the Dalits into in both the RSS and the BJP is it has taken local gods, built temples for the local gods. Because in India there are gods and godlings for all sorts of groups that represent often more than just that issue of a god, but represents them as a group, and has done so in what this person felt a very effective way in mobilizing support. And I have a personal incident about that. It actually has not to do with the RSS. The driver of the ambassador when I was in India died, and they gave a ceremony. And I went to the ceremony, and there was a priest. And I later found out the priest had been hired by these drivers. These drivers had, in effect, organized themselves as a kind of caste in India. Embassy drivers, the top of the driving scale are the embassy drivers, had organized themselves. And in fact, I later asked, there was a RSS person who was giving instruction to this priest ahead of time, which is what interested me. And the rituals he could perform that combined the high Hinduism with the Hinduism that many of these drivers, and they tended to come from lower castes, were associated with. It struck me this was a very clever tactic that they had, or I should say maybe effective tactic, in organizing support.
Yeah.
So it, sometimes the boundary can seem thin. For example, the Prime Minister has organized these various rituals in connection with the two temples that he wants, the Ram temple and most recently the Kashi temple in Varanasi. And he led the ceremony, and remember he's an other backward class person. There were Brahmin priests who were affiliated to that. He gave instructions to them what to do. And I was looking at that, and my wife says, that's really revolutionary, what he's doing. In that, he tends to be turning the whole caste system on its head. Is he personally religious? I suspect he may be, but he probably has his own religion, its own God. But many of the people I know, and I won't give their names, I know are atheists and never go to a temple.
Yeah.
But they do respect things like the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and that sort of thing.
Right, right.
Thank you. Professor Andersen, so for all intents and purposes, the RSS is a formidable organization. You've gone into the details. I'd like to pick up one of the issues which you mentioned in your remarks. India is a centuries-old civilization. People of all faiths have lived here. In your book, you state that for the RSS, and in your remarks also, the term Hindu is cultural, not religious, and applicable to all people, not just to those who practice Hinduism. But its critics always point to incidents, especially over the last 8 years, on attacks on religious minorities, especially Muslims and Christians. So how does the RSS view these incidents? How does the RSS see what is happening in India, and what do you think they make of the changes which have taken place?
Well, the changes, they've accommodated themselves to social and economic changes they have, in part because of the establishment of all these affiliated organizations, which feeds them with information that covers several economic areas as well, and social areas. On charges of whether it could do more when there are attacks, yes, it could do more. And we so note in our book. There are people within the RSS and the BJP, and then the Prime Minister himself has spoken out, but they might do it, I think. I think that they have not done it as forcefully as they should. Now, why is that? I've had all sort of reasons given to me as to why they haven't been more forceful in it. Now, they have said this is a law and order issue, which it is. And they have approached it as a law and order issue, that if someone is damaged, property is damaged, someone is injured, or someone is killed, the law should come down on those people. That's not enough. You've got to do more than law and order, I think. Yes, I think that's one area where they need to be more forceful.
Besides family relations and the mixing and merging between the peoples of America and the peoples of India that has been happening at an accelerated pace, I'd say, since the 1990s, the other thing that's clearly driving our two countries together is, of course, China. So I have a strategic security question. India, as we all know, is a crucial partner to the United States. It's an anchor of the Indo-Pacific project and of the Quad nations. And I'm curious your thinking about how the RSS, which has a long tradition about thinking about its neighborhood, including its large neighbor to the north, northeast, how the RSS thinks about China and the challenges, threats, and possibilities that the rise of China poses for India's emergence.
It's never had a favorable view of China, in large part because of the Tibet issue, and then the later war that they fought with China in the early 60s, and then the problems they have in the northwest of India, in Ladakh. In fact, I'm curious you asked a question. I'm writing an article now on how India is responding to the Ukraine issue. And there's a China element in that as well. What comments I have seen tend to take the view that, curiously enough, somewhat depends on the Chinese, what they do. Because the sense of a larger country invading a smaller country and getting away with it, which is what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, there is the analog that worries them. What if the Chinese should decide to do so, not just against Taiwan, but against the Northeast? And on Chinese maps, Arunachal Pradesh, a state in the Northeast, is not listed as Indian. It's listed as Chinese. I taught at a Chinese university twice a year for a seminar, 5 weeks each, and the thing that always interested me, they always gave me a map of South Asia. And the first time I saw this map, I looked at the map and I said, that's curious. It's not the same map that I know, because it listed much of Northeast India, and Ladakh, by the way, as part of China. And there are some Chinese who have argued that we need to take it. And so the RSS and BJP, though more so the RSS, the BJP Modi has been somewhat more business-oriented in relations with China. In fact, he's been to China more than to any other foreign country, which I think a lot of people don't realize. And he's been able to, and mainly to encourage Chinese investment, first when he was chief minister of Gujarat and now as prime minister. But and India, as you know, on the vote that was taken, India abstained from them, as did China, by the way. And there's been a lot of criticism of that. But the Indians tend to argue that since the Russians supply such a large part of their military equipment, and that they have backed India in the past when it came to troubles of one kind or another, they need to be cautious in how they handle a superpower. The RSS has been, what should I say? As I said, what comments you hear tends to have the Chinese element, and that, to let a major country get away with occupying or attacking a smaller one, they see the China-India equivalent, and that bothers them. And the RSS has long had a certain sympathy for the government on Taiwan as well. So that's the angle which they look at, and particularly if the Chinese should begin to give military aid to the Russians, the Indian government may begin to pull back a bit, but the RSS, I think, certainly would.
Thank you. You mentioned this in your remarks, and I'd like to draw you out a little bit on this. The ideological or maybe political conflict which is there between the two sides of the RSS Parivar Sangh Parivar on economics, on foreign investment, on sort of so between the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, on one side, and let's say the more pragmatic political leadership, Prime Minister Modi and others.
Yeah.
So India needs foreign investment. India is attractive to most countries around the world and corporations because of its large economic potential. And most experts and economists believe India needs to grow at double digits. For that, India needs to be more open, less inward-looking, and more sort of, less protectionist. Could you elaborate on this ideological struggle and also RSS economic vision? How does it see India in the global, trade as a part of the global trade, and what is its economic vision, or is it still trying to clarify that economic vision, and its focus is more cultural and social right now? Where do you see RSS following?
It's long addressed economic issues because it's long recognized economic issues also have a bearing on culture and society. Now, historically, they have taken a very autonomous view towards India and its economy, that foreign investment, foreign involvement is not a good thing because it brings foreign influences into India, which could be and often are, in their view, unwelcome. That view was predominant, I'd say, until this head of the RSS, Mohan Bhagwat, who gave a set of lectures that were very significant in terms of defining the RSS in 2018 in Delhi. You may have seen references to those series of public lectures, in which he pulled back from the historic RSS opposition to foreign investment, arguing that it may be necessary, particularly in areas of new technologies. But I think influencing his thinking is the large number of RSS members who are overseas, including in this country, in the U.S., and they tend to have a certain voice with the upper leadership of the RSS. In fact, Mohan Bhagwat came here a couple of years ago to give a talk. He came to Chicago on the invitation of some very prominent members of the RSS. The RSS affiliate in the U.S. is called the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh. And though there's been a little controversy over that name because that tends to focus on the religious aspects of it rather than the cultural aspects of it. So foreign people, foreign RSS members involved in business have had, I think, a certain impact on it. Then there's the very growth of the RSS itself. It had once been limited to a very small, as I said, upper caste urban elite. In India. It is much broader now. In fact, it includes a lot of people who are lower middle class in terms of caste as well as economics. And the RSS information organization is rather impressive. Information has been feeding back that the growth rate has to be higher than it is now if you're going to favorably impact the well-being of these people. And so how do you get foreign direct investment? And how do you get high technology to come into the country? So they have actually supported, well, they have spoken out, some of its members, in favor. But as you mentioned, the Jagron Munch, which is one of its major affiliated organizations, is dead set against it for all the reasons that the RSS had historically been against it. The introduction of foreign ideas, the introduction of maybe Indian industry would become somewhat beholden to foreign industry, and a whole range of affiliated reasons. So you have a continuing debate on that, but the government and Modi is, I think his views are now the predominant ones, which also tells you something interesting about Modi and the RSS. He is without a doubt the most prominent person within that largest Sangh Parivar and all those organizations. He is the most prominent. And in fact, before he was nominated to be the BJP candidate for prime minister, the RSS, because he had been a full-time RSS member at one time before he got into politics, canvassed the field to find out, what do you think about Modi? Word came back from the field that he was extremely popular and that people saw him as a person who could, it wasn't just the BJP as such that had a role, or the RSS as such, but that he could play a significant role, as he had in Gujarat, in terms of development. Development was the model. And in fact, it was the model through his first prime ministership as well. The second one has begun to veer, and I think you'd suggested in your question, into a more cultural, quasi-religious as well, where he has spent a lot of time and effort on temple reconstruction, particularly the two big ones, and the third one, which is staring down the road at Mathura, which is a temple for Krishna. And so the other one, Shiva, is at Kashi, and then there's Ram, of course, and the third one. And I think they're waiting to see, I think you're going to see trial balloons go up about what to do, because I don't think they want this issue to become very controversial, particularly not before the elections. And besides, there's a law on the books that was passed that said, as of the day of independence, though they made an exception of the Ram Temple, and that law was passed 2 decades later, no existing religious structure could be converted to another one. And so you come across that, what to do with that law.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier, I mean, that RSS obviously is not a monolith, and you've really revealed how diverse internally the Sangh Parivar is, which we all deeply appreciate. I wanted to ask you about where you see the politics of the BJP going after Modi, who has played such a profound role. I mean, already we're seeing, I would say as an outsider, a bit of a tussle between two very different men. First, you have Yogi Adityanath, the chief minister in Uttar Pradesh, which of course is a state the size of Brazil in terms of population. And then, of course, Ram Madhav, who's the head of BJP. And I'm curious, I mean, they have very different platforms, it seems to me, different kinds of agendas, both domestically and internationally. It may be that the differences between them will appear greater in years ahead as elections come, but I'm curious your thoughts about that.
I think you mean Amit Shah. Not Ram Madhav. Ram Madhav actually is no longer.
Amit Shah is also very interesting. I meant Ram Madhav.
Because he's no longer in the BJP.
Right, okay.
They booted him out. We won't get into that as to what was behind that, because he may come back in again. Amit Shah is the prime minister's closest confidant, and has been for years, ever since the prime minister went into politics in Gujarat, and has been successful, and not only in advertising the BJP and the prime minister and advancing his career, But the recent elections show that. He was, in a sense, responsible for UP, both times, the previous state assembly election and this one as well. And he was extraordinarily good at organizing. And among the things he's done is to have a kind of group in each constituency that looks at issues and advise local candidates in the party and sends word up and down. No other organization in India has anything quite like that. He's also the all-important Home Minister of India, and sits on a number of committees as well. He is the closest person to the Prime Minister. And if you watched the Prime Minister on the night of his last parliamentary victory, who was always next to him was Amit Shah.
Right.
Always next to him. And so a lot of people have assumed that Amit Shah would be the logical successor. He's several years younger than the Prime Minister. I'm not sure about that, because so far he hasn't given any indication of having an interest in elected politics. I'm also told he's not an especially good speaker. And in India, the power of the word is very important. You have to really be able to, articulate your ideas. And in fact, a politician in India is something of an actor as well as a politician. They expect them to be kind of entertained, as you know. That if you get up and you can't say anything, or you stumble around, the fact, that's not a person for us. The Prime Minister is excellent. From the time he was quite young, he was engaged in acting, and it has stood him in very good stead since. Amit Shah is not good. I've met him several times. I remember the last time I met him, without sort of giving away too much, one of the senior people in the RSS introduced me. It was a meeting they had, forgot where, somewhere in Delhi, and said, "Oh, this is Mr. Andersen, and he's studying, he's studying us, the RSS, and I wanted to introduce him." He said that he's met you, but he's never had a chance to talk to you. Then he looked at me. Amit Shah looked at me, and I could see the way he looked at me. He was wondering, what does this guy have of any importance to me? And obviously nothing. And he said, "Oh, how nice. Goodbye." He went off. I mean, that, in terms for his purposes of building the party, that may be okay. Yeah. But, in terms of, unlike the Prime Minister, who, when I meet, has always remembered who my wife's name was, the children, remarkable memory, which all good politicians have, in terms of that sort of thing. And so, which has led me to believe that Amit Shah is probably not a serious contender as a successor. You never know. People, when they get close to power, want to stay close to power. Right. The other person is the yogi, Adityanath. His problem is he's not an RSS member, and has never been. And it makes a difference. He's not a part of that grouping. And they tend, to interact with each other, and they have a certain sense of compatibility with each other. A lot of people have assumed he must have been a full-time RSS member like the Prime Minister. No, he never was.
Never was.
He had a temple that he was, inherited in a sense from his predecessor, but he has never been an RSS member. In fact, at some points it's criticized years ago, not now, years ago. And so whether or not you can have a non-RSS person as the BJP candidate for Prime Minister, I'm not sure. Now, the Prime Minister is what? He was born in 1950, 72, 72 years old. He has said, and others have said, that you should retire when you're 75. Yeah. And that has been said in the RSS as well, because the head of the RSS was also born in 1950. The question is, will either one of them retire? I'm not sure, because many statements that Modi has made, he talks about things that he wants, laying the groundwork for things that will take quite a while to implement. And it is difficult to give up that kind of power once you've had it. And so will he stay on? If I had to make a guess at this point as to whether he will stay on, my guess is yes, at least for one more term. Because at the end of one more term, he will be, 74, 79? He's, as far as we know, he's very healthy. He does yoga on a regular basis. He watches his diet, and as far as we know, but so is Amit Shah and the yogi are also, healthy people. Can I think of anything? Those two people who come to mind as the most likely. One other name occasionally comes up is Nitin Gadkari, who is a prominent person, BJP person, from Maharashtra. He is very close to the RSS leadership. Has been a very successful businessman, a very efficient bureaucrat, and so helping to develop roads and railroads and ports in India. But I don't hear his name. I used to hear his name a lot, as a possible follow-on, but I don't hear it as much anymore. I can't think of any local politicians who rise to that level. I just can't. And from what we know, particularly in these last elections, indicated that both the state elections and the last national elections, Modi has no opposition, real opposition within the BJP. He did at one time. In fact, when he first came to power, there were people who really were not happy, including a person who had been one of the most powerful people in the BJP, L.K. Advani, was not happy at all. And there were others, but these days you hear almost no opposition. At least I haven't, and if you read their publications, it's all praise and very little else. And the same is true of Bhagwat. Bhagwat has no real opposition I'm aware of either. It's harder to predict who's next to come in line in the RSS, because in the RSS, it's people who tended to stay till they die. It's something like hope that you stay till you die. That's not necessary. There have been somebody who retired because of illness, and my guess is that Mohan Bhagwat, as long as he stays healthy, will remain the head of the RSS. Who will be the prime minister's successor? I don't know, but here again, I suspect that that's a question that we're not going to really have to sort of look at seriously for quite a while now.
The final question I'd like to ask you is, since we are sitting in the United States, one of the strengths of the India-US relationship is the strong people-to-people ties, the fact that if you do surveys in both countries have a very high public opinion of the other, whether it's Pew polls here or surveys there. In this context, how does the RSS, which is such a dominant organization which influences not just the Sangh Parivar, but the broader society as well as the government, how does it view the United States, American cultural influence, and American economic and military power? What's the RSS view of America?
It's divided within the organization. There are some, the older view was a certain suspicion of the United States as being hedonistic. The movies being often immoral, too much focus on the material aspects of that. And the Jagran Manch people, for example, you read their publications, they're very critical of the U.S. There are others as well, however, who are much more favorably inclined to the U.S., seeing it as a country which has, of a Western country, perhaps is the most religious of the Western countries in terms of church attendance and that sort of thing. And in many ways, the most conservative in terms of social rules and norms, which I think is probably true. And therefore have a certain sympathy. And because the U.S. now, for those who are opposed to communism, I'm not sure where communism exists anymore. So it certainly is, in terms of as a form, it's been significantly altered in China itself. Except the only thing that the Chinese kept of communism is the Leninist, dictatorship part of it, which now the Russians seem to be moving back in that direction as well. But I would say on the U.S., and they come, many people in the RSS come here frequently because they have relatives here and they have events here and that sort of thing. And when elections are held, a lot for the BJP, a lot of people here, a lot of people with Indian background have gone to India, to help. And you probably know some. I know many who have done so as well, who have gone to to campaign, particularly because the BJP has, as has the RSS, has really been very advanced in adopting very technical ways to manage to get opinions, to broadcast its message. There's often an assumption that most Indians here are pro-BJP. Not true. I'll give you a personal example of that. My mother-in-law, staunch congressperson that she was, South Indian Brahmin, a local RSS person called up because I forgot what election, I think it was the first 2014 national elections and said, "We won." My mother-in-law answered the telephone, and he said, "Oh, we won, Pati, we won, we won." She said, "Who won what?" He said, "Oh, the BJP. Isn't that great?" And she said to him, "I'm not sure." It's all that great. But his call was on the assumption that she must be. And not all Indians here are, support, but many of them are. And I think there is a certain pride among many Indians that the BJP has done, has sort of helped India to develop, and that development is its goal. And in terms of how the BJP has looked at politics, everyone knows that a lot of their members, Swayamsevaks, work in elections. And in fact, most of the cabinet members are RSS members, and most of the chief ministers of India who are BJP are also RSS members. But they have been very cautious about getting too up front because they know that generates criticism against them. And so they stop short of that. And I'll give you one example I note in the book. In the last assembly elections in Bihar, the head of the RSS said, well, we have to look at, I think he said, again at the issue of quotas to certain groups at the exclusion of other groups. There was a outburst of criticism against him by BJP, even some within the RSS, that this is not a wise thing to say. You shouldn't get that out front on a political issue which hasn't been decided. So they have, on such issues, they've tended to pull back.
Before we conclude, any remarks you would like to give in the end, Professor Andersen?
Give who?
If you would like to give any concluding remarks.
I think this is an organization, the RSS, that we're going to have to sort of look at. For people, I think, as you mentioned, who want to understand India, they really have to understand the RSS. Not only because so many of its members go into the BJP and various of its affiliated organizations have real power. It has the largest labor union in India, and they play a role. It has one of the largest farm groups, which is interesting because its farm group opposed the government's. This is where the government and one of its affiliates have differed on the farm legislation to introduce market economy more into the purchase of farm product. It opposed it. And opposed it strongly. And the other issue is on labor reform. Its labor affiliate has also opposed the government on the labor reforms to make it easier for business to fire labor. And I'll just say one quick thing about how the BJP did a compromise on that is that the Indian Constitution says that in certain areas, of which labor is one, that if the central government doesn't rule on it, then the states can. And so several states have passed legislation, in effect doing what the BJP central government has done. Not all, there are some states which haven't, BJP states, but some have done so. So they have done that. But by and large, the RSS has been cautious about speaking out on issues which are controversial. When it does so, it'll do so in small in-house groups where it will talk about that, but in terms of public pronouncements on it, it's been much more cautious. And in fact, its caution, in some ways is good for India, I think. For those who are concerned, and there are reasons to be concerned about an ideology like this, and it's so pervasively, it backs a party which is so pervasively popular and likely to be in power a long time. There are people, in that group which are on the far right side, who do engage in violence. And I think that the government really, they're not pleased, and I know some of the leadership is not pleased, but I think they need to speak out more strongly about that.
Thank you so much. This has been an scintillating and interesting conversation about an organization that is so powerful and formidable, and about politics in India for the coming, at least I'd say, decade or more. So thank you, Professor Andersen. Thank you, Eric.
Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.